Sipurei masios, the 12th story, the master of prayer. Once there was a master of prayer. He was constantly engaged in prayer and in singing songs and praises to God. He lived away from civilization. However, he would visit inhabited areas on a regular basis. When he came, he would spend time with the people, usually those of low status, such as the poor. He would have heart-to-heart discussions with them, speaking about the goal. He would explain that the only true goal was to serve God all the days of one's life, spending one's days praying to God and singing his praise. He would speak to an individual at great length, motivating him so that his words entered the other's heart, and the individual would join him. As soon as a person agreed with him, he would take him and bring him to his place away from civilization. For this purpose, the master of prayer had chosen for himself a place far from civilization. There was a river flowing there, as well as fruit trees, whose fruit he and his followers would eat. He was not at all concerned about clothing. It was the custom of the master of prayer to visit inhabited areas and spread his ideas, convincing people to emulate him, serving God and constantly praying. Whenever people wanted to join him, he would take them to his place away from civilization, where their only activities would be praying, singing praise to God, confessing, fasting, self-mortification, repentance, and similar occupations. He would give them his books. He would give them his books of prayers, songs, praises, and confessions. And they would occupy themselves with them at all times. Among the people he brought there, he would find individuals who had the ability to lead others to serve God. He would allow such individuals to visit inhabited areas and also bring people to serve God. In this manner, the master of prayer constantly spread his teachings. He would constantly attract people and bring them away from civilization. Eventually, his teachings began to make an impression, and his activities became well known. People would suddenly vanish without a trace. No one knew where they are. A person might lose his son or his son-in-law and not have any idea of his whereabouts. But finally, people began to realize that all this was due to the master of prayer, who was attracting people to serve God. People tried to capture him, but it was impossible to recognize him. The master of prayer devised clever plans, or more literally conducted himself with wisdom in different ways. The master of prayer devised clever plans, or more literally conducted himself with wisdom, and he would constantly disguise himself in different ways. Every time he visited a person, he would be disguised differently. With one person, he would be a pauper, with another a merchant, while with others he would have different disguises. On many occasions, when he spoke to the people, he saw that he could not make any impression on them and could not draw them to his goal. He would then engage in subterfuges, so they would not be aware of his intention. It would appear that his intent was not at all to bring people to God. It was totally impossible to recognize that this was his purpose, although his main intent was only to draw people close to God, and this was his entire motivation. Whenever he saw that he was not making any impression, he would use roundabout ways so that the person would not recognize his true intent. The master of prayer kept this up until he began to make a major impression on the world. He also became quite famous. People tried to capture him, but it was not possible. The master of prayer and his men lived far away from civilization. They would spend their time engaged only in prayer, song, praise of God, confession, fasting, self-mortification, and repentance. The system of the master of prayer was to provide each of his followers with what he needed. If he realized that one of his followers, according to that follower's mentality, needed to wear golden robes, golden gishtik, in order to serve God, then he would provide them for him. On the other hand, occasionally, he would attract a wealthy person and bring him away from civilization. If he understood that he needed to wear torn, humble clothing, he would instruct him to do so. This was his general custom. He would provide each one with what he understood to be necessary for him. For the people he attracted to God, fasting and self-mortification were better and more precious than all worldly enjoyment. They would have greater pleasure from fasting or self-mortification than from all worldly pleasures. Meanwhile, there was a land that had great wealth. Everyone there was wealthy. This land, however, had very strange and unusual customs, since everything was made dependent on wealth. Thus, a person's status and worth were determined solely on the basis of his wealth. One who had thousands or 10,000s in cash had a certain rank, while others who had different amounts had a different rank. The entire order of social rank was thus determined by the amount of money that each one had. According to their constitution, the one with the most money was king. The people there had banners. There was one banner that denoted a certain amount of money, and a certain rank associated with that banner. For a different sum of money, there would be a different banner, with a different rank associated with it. Thus, a person with one degree of wealth would have a banner conferring one rank, and one with a different degree of wealth would have a different banner conferring a different rank. Each person's rank and status was thus determined by how much wealth he had. Rank was determined in the following manner. If a person had a certain amount of money, he was considered an ordinary human being. If he had less than this, then he would be considered a bird or a beast. Some people even had the status of harmful animals and birds. If a person had only a small amount of wealth, he might be considered a human lion or the like. Thus the poorest among them were considered no better than birds or beasts, since money was the most important thing to them, and status was decided solely on the basis of wealth. News of this land began to spread. The master of prayer sighed because of this and said, Who knows how far they will go because of this, and what great errors they will make. Some of the master of prayer's men visited that land without even seeking his advice. They wanted to bring the people back to the good way, since they had great pity on them for having fallen into such great error through their desire for wealth. They were all the more concerned since the master of prayer had said that the people of that land could fall into even greater error. These men therefore went to the land, hoping to be able to get them to improve their ways. When they came to that land, they approached an individual. Most probably, they approached a wild beast, that is, a person who had so little wealth and such low rank that he was considered a wild animal. They began to speak to him in their way, telling him that wealth is no goal at all, and the only true goal is to serve God. The individual, however, would not listen to them at all. The belief that money was the main thing in life was too deeply rooted in the people there. They went to another individual, and he too would not listen. Finally, one of the master of prayer's men engaged a man in conversation, speaking to him at great length. The man eventually said, I don't have any more time to speak to you. Why? Asked the other. The man replied, because we are all preparing to move away from this land. We are migrating to another area. Since we realize that the main goal in life is only wealth, we have decided to move to a land where we can amass wealth. It is a place where gold and silver can be taken from the ground. We are all prepared to migrate to that land. Around this time, the people agreed that they wanted to establish the rank of stars and constellation, masios. If a person had a certain agreed upon amount of wealth, he would be a star. The logic was that one who had that much wealth had the power of a star, since a star can increase the amount of gold in the world. Wherever gold ore exists, it is because the star made gold dust grow in that area. Therefore, gold is derived from the stars. Hence, one who had a certain amount of wealth was considered to have the power of a star. Therefore, he himself was also a star. They also conferred the rank of constellation. If a person had a certain determined amount of wealth, he would be a constellation. Eventually, they also established the rank of angel. This too depended on a person's wealth. Finally, they also agreed to confer the rank of gods. If a person had a huge amount of wealth as set up in their rules, then he would be a god. Since God had granted him such great wealth, that person would also be a god. Once this had been established, they agreed that it was not fitting for them to remain in the atmosphere of this world. Moreover, it was not considered fitting for them to mix with other people in the world, since this would defile them. They considered all other people in the world to be unclean. They therefore decided that they would search for the highest mountains in the world and live there. Then they would be higher than all the air in the world. They sent out explorers to find the highest mountains. They explored and found very high mountains, and all the people of the land migrated to these mountains. On every mountain there was a group of people from that land. Around each mountain they erected great fortifications, chazokos in Hebrew. They also made deep trenches around the mountain, so that it would be utterly impossible for anyone to approach them. The only approach was through a hidden path to the mountain, so that no strangers would be able to come to them. Similar fortifications were also erected around all the other mountains. Guards were stationed far from the mountains, so that no strangers would be allowed to approach them. They lived there in the mountains and abided by their customs. These people worshipped many gods. They were appointed on the basis of wealth, since wealth was the main thing to these people. Through a great amount of wealth, one could become a god. This, however, brought about great concern about murder and robbery. People would be very ready to kill and steal, since they could become gods with the stolen money. They were afraid to, however, because the wealthy were considered gods. They were thus considered to be able to protect themselves from robbery and assassination. They set up a system of services and sacrifices to their gods. They would also offer human sacrifices. Many people would also voluntarily offer themselves as sacrifices to their gods, believing that they would then become reincarnated into them, and believing that they would then become incorporated into them, and later being reincarnated as wealthy men, They thus institutionalized their belief in wealth. They had services, sacrifice, and incense, which were used to serve the extremely wealthy people who were their gods. Nevertheless, there was much killing and robbery in the land. People who did not believe in their religion became murderers and thieves in order to amass wealth. Their main thing in life was money. With money, one could buy anything, whether it be food or clothing. According to their belief system, human existence was based on money. Wealth was therefore the focus of their belief. Every effort was made that there not be any lack of money, since it was their main object of faith and the focus of their gods. They made every effort to bring wealth from other places to their land. Merchants were therefore sent out to do business in other lands so as to earn money and bring it back to their homeland. According to their religion, charity was a very great sin. They believed that if a person gave charity, it would diminish the influx of wealth that God had given him. The main goal was to have as much wealth as possible, and if one gave charity, it would blemish and diminish one's wealth. It was therefore forbidden in the strongest terms to give charity. They also had officers. These officers were in charge of determining whether or not each person had as much wealth as he claimed. Each individual would have to be able constantly to demonstrate his wealth in order to retain his wealth status. Sometimes an animal would become a human being, and at other times a human would become an animal. If a person lost his wealth, then he would become an animal who did not have to have so much money. Similarly, if an animal amassed wealth, he could become a human being. This was true of all ranks. Rank could be gained or lost depending on one's wealth. These people also had images and icons of the wealthy people who were their gods. These people also had images and icons of the wealthy people who were their gods. They would embrace these images and kiss them. This was part of the religious service. Sorry if it says it later, but the Rebbe says also that a person could become not God anymore. If he lost his money, he became oisgot. He was once God, and he lost his money, so he stopped being God. The Master of Prayer's virtuous followers who had visited the land of wealth returned home and told the Master of Prayer about the foolishness and great error of the land. They related how these people had become confused because of their lust for wealth, and how they wanted to move to another land and set up the rank of stars and constellations. The Master of Prayer replied that he was afraid that these people would become involved in even greater error. Then he heard that they had made themselves into gods. The Master of Prayer said that this had been his original concern. He had great pity on these people and decided that he himself would go there, since he might be able to make them abandon their error. When the Master of Prayer arrived in that land, he approached the guards who stood around the mountain. These watchmen were probably insignificant individuals of low rank, since they were allowed to breathe the atmosphere of the world. Citizens who had rank, as a result of their wealth, would not breathe the atmosphere of the world and could not mingle with other people, since they believed that this would defile them. They could not even speak to foreigners, since they believed that they would become defiled by their breath. Therefore, the guards who stood outside the city must have been of very low rank. Nevertheless, the guards had images which they would constantly embrace and kiss. Belief in wealth was also their religion. The master of prayer approached one guard and began to discuss the goal of life. He explained that the main goal is only to serve God through Torah, prayer, and good deeds. Wealth is mere foolishness and is not the goal at all. The guard would not listen to him at all. All his life he had been imbued with the belief that the main thing is wealth. When the master of prayer went to a second guard and spoke to him, this guard also would not listen to him. He went to all the guards in this manner, but none of them would pay any attention to him. The master of prayer finally made up his mind that he would go into the city on the mountain. When he arrived, the people considered it a great wonder. "How did you get here?" they asked. "It is impossible for any outsider to come here." "I've already got in," he replied. "It does not matter how I did it. Why bother asking me about it?" The master of prayer began to speak to one of the people about the goal of life, but the other refused to listen. He went to a second, and the same thing happened. None of them would listen to him, since they were totally immersed in their false belief. The citizens of the city found it very surprising that someone would speak to them in this manner, which was directly opposed to their faith. Soon, however, people began to realize that this stranger might be the master of prayer. They had already heard that such a master of prayer existed. The existence of the master of prayer was already well known in the world. Throughout the world, he was called the religious master of prayer. In Yiddish, der frime Baal Tefillah. Also the devout prayer leader, or the devout cantor. However, it was known that it was impossible to recognize or capture him, since he would always appear in a different disguise. He would appear to one person as a merchant and to another as a pauper. When the master of prayer realized that his identity had been discovered, he immediately fled from the land. Meanwhile, there was a mighty warrior, a gibor. Many other warriors had joined him. The mighty warrior and his men were conquering one land after another. The mighty warrior only demanded subjugation. If the citizens of a land subjugated themselves to him, he would spare them. But if not, he would destroy them. He went and conquered. He did not want any wealth, only that the people subjugate themselves to him. It was the custom of the mighty warrior to send soldiers to a land when he was still far away, some 50 miles distant. The message was that the populace must subjugate themselves to him. In this manner, he conquered many lands. When traders from the land of wealth returned home from doing business in other lands, they brought back reports of this mighty warrior. All the people were terrified. Initially, they wanted to subjugate themselves to him. However, they then heard that he despised wealth and did not want any wealth at all. This was diametrically opposed to their faith, and it was therefore impossible for them to subjugate themselves to him. To do so would be apostasy, since he did not at all believe in their faith, which was wealth. Because of their great fear of him, they began to worship and bring sacrifice to their gods. They took people of lesser wealth, whom they considered animals, and sacrificed them to their gods. They also engaged in other similar acts of worship. Meanwhile, the mighty warrior was constantly coming closer to them. He began to send soldiers, asking if they were willing to submit to his way, and they became terrified. They did not know what to do. Their traders came forth with advice. They told them of a land where all the people were gods, who rode on angels. All the people of that land, great and small alike, were so wealthy that according to the standards of the land of wealth, they would all be gods. Even the lowliest among the people in the land was so wealthy that in the land of wealth he would be a god. The people of that land used angels for transportation. Their horses were bedecked with so much gold and treasure that their ornamentation alone would be enough to confer the status of angel upon a person in the land of wealth. They therefore used angels for transportation. They would harness 3 pairs of angels to their coaches, and this would be their means of transportation. Therefore, the trader said, "You must send messengers to this land, since all the people in this land were gods. They would certainly be able to help you." They believed that they would surely be helped by that land, since everyone there was a god. Meanwhile, the master of prayer decided to return to the land of wealth, hoping to wean them away from their erroneous belief. When he arrived, he approached the guards and began to speak to them. He spoke to one guard in his normal manner, but the guard began to tell him about the mighty warrior, relating how terrified they were of him. "What are you going to do?" asked the master of prayer. The guard told him that they were planning to send a delegation to the land where all the people were gods. The master of prayer laughed at him very much. "What great foolishness," he said. "The people in that land are human beings just like us. The same is true of you. Your gods are just human beings, not deities. There's only one God in the world, and that is the Creator. May His name be blessed. He alone deserves our worship, and to Him alone must we pray. And to Him alone must we pray. This is the main goal." The master of prayer spoke to the guard in this manner at some length, but the guard would not listen to him, since he had been immersed in his erroneous beliefs for a long time. Nevertheless, the master of prayer spoke to him for a long time, until the guard finally replied, "Besides, what can I do? I'm only one, and they are many." To some degree, these words were a consolation to the master of prayer. He understood that his words had begun to make an impression on the guard. The words that the master of prayer had spoken to this guard the previous time, combined with the words he spoke this time, began to make a bit of an impression on his heart. The guard now had begun to have doubts, and to lean toward the master of prayer's teaching somewhat, as was evident from his reply. The master of prayer went to the second guard and spoke to him in the same manner, but this one would also not listen. However, in the end, he finally said, "But I am only a single person opposing all the people in the land." In the end, all the guards gave him a similar reply. The master of prayer then entered the city and began to speak to the people in his way. He told them that they were in great error, and theirs was not the true goal at all, since the main goal was to engage in Torah and prayer. However, since all the people had been immersed in their beliefs for a very long time, they would not listen to him. When they told him about the mighty warrior and their plan to send to the land where everyone was a god, he laughed at them. "This is foolishness," he said. "They are all mere human beings, and they will not be able to help you at all. They are not gods at all. You are human beings, and they are human beings, and not gods at all. There is only one God, may His name be blessed." About the mighty warrior, he said, "Can this be the mighty warrior?" From the tone of his voice, it seemed as if he knew the warrior. The people did not understand what he was getting at. He also went to other people and spoke to them. Whenever the warrior was mentioned, he would say, "Can this be the mighty warrior?" No one understood what his point was. There was a great stir in the city, since there was someone there mocking their faith and preaching that there was only one God. He was also saying strange remarks about the mighty warrior. They understood that this was the master of prayer, since he was quite well known by this name. Orders were given that he be found and captured, although he was constantly disguising himself, sometimes appearing as a merchant and at other times as a pauper. They were already aware of his disguises. They gave orders that he be found and taken prisoner. They searched for him, and when they captured him, they brought him before the ministers of state. When they began to speak to him, he told them that all of them had very foolish beliefs and were in error. "Wealth is not the goal of life at all," he said. "The only goal is the Creator. May His name be blessed. You may think the people of that land are gods, but they will not be able to help you at all, since they are only human beings." He was considered mad. The people in that land were so immersed in their belief in wealth that anyone who spoke against them was considered a madman. They then asked him, "Whenever the mighty warrior is mentioned, you ask, 'Can this be the mighty warrior?' What is the meaning of your words?" "I was once with a king," he replied, "and he had a mighty warrior who was lost. If the warrior is this mighty warrior, then I know him. Furthermore, your faith in the land where you considered all the people gods is mere foolishness. They will not be able to help you. In my opinion, if you trust in them, it will be your downfall." "How do you know that?" they asked. He replied, The king with the king with whom I was had a hand. That is, he had an image of a hand with 5 fingers. The lines on the hand formed a map of the world. Everything that existed from the time heaven and earth were created until the end, and even what will exist after that, was inscribed on that hand. The lines in the hand provided a picture of the structure of every universe with all its details. Just like a map, the lines also formed letters, like the inscriptions on a map, so that one can know what each thing is. Landkaart, a landkaart in Yiddish. Landkaart. Thus, one can know that in one place there is a city, and elsewhere a river, and the like. The lines in the hand were like captions on a map, inscribed next to each detail on the hand, so that one could know what it was. Inscribed with the lines on the hand were the details of all the lands, cities, rivers, bridges, mountains, and other details. In this world and in other worlds. Next to each detail, there were letters describing it. Also on the hand were inscribed the names of all the people traveling in each land, as well as everything that happened to them. It also had inscribed all the paths from one land to another and from one place to another. This is how I knew how to get into the city. Even though it would be impossible for anyone else to get in here. Also, if you wished to send me to any other city, I would also know the way. Everything through this hand. Also inscribed on this hand is the path from one world to another. There is a road and a path, derech and nesiv, upon which one can travel from earth to heaven. The only reason that it is impossible to go up to heaven is because people do not know the path, but on the hand is inscribed the path to heaven. On it are written all the paths from one universe to another. Elijah and Eliyahu went up to heaven on one path, and that path is inscribed on the hand. Moshe went up on a different path, and that path is also inscribed. Enoch, Chanoich went up to heaven in still another way, and that is also inscribed there. The paths from one world to another are also inscribed in the lines of the hand. Also inscribed on the hand is everything as it existed at the time of creation, the way it exists now, and the way it will exist later. Thus, Sodom is inscribed as it was when it was inhabited, before it was destroyed. The destruction and upheaval of Sodom is then inscribed, as well as the way Sodom exists after it was destroyed. Thus, inscribed on the hand is what was, what is, and what will be. The destruction and upheaval of Sodom is then inscribed, as well as the way Sodom exists after it was destroyed. Thus inscribed on the hand is what was, what is, and what will be. On the hand I also saw the land which you described, where you claim that the people are gods, as well as all the men who are going to seek help from them. All of them will be annihilated and destroyed. All the above was the answer that the Master of Prayer gave them. This was a great wonder to them. They realized that he was speaking the truth, since they were aware that everything could be drawn on maps. They also recognized his words as being true, because they saw that it was possible to bring together and connect 2 lines on the hand and form a letter. They realized that it would have been impossible for him to make up such an account. It was therefore a great wonder to them. "Where is your king?" they asked. "Maybe he can tell us how to gain more wealth." "You still want wealth?" he replied. "I don't want you to mention wealth at all." Still they insisted, "Where is the king?" "Actually, I don't know where the king is," he answered. This is what happened. The Master of Prayer then related the following story. There was a king and a queen, and they had an only daughter. When she came of age, they sought advice from the counselors as to who would be fit to marry her. I was among the advisors, since the king was very fond of me. My advice was that she should marry the mighty warrior. The mighty warrior had captured many lands and brought great benefits to the kingdom, and therefore it would be proper to have him marry the queen's daughter. My advice was well taken, and everyone agreed to it. there was a great joy, since a husband had been found for the queen's daughter. She married the mighty warrior. The queen's daughter gave birth to a child, and the infant was extremely beautiful. His beauty was beyond all human bounds. His hair was gold with all colors. Beyond all human bounds literally was not human beauty at all. His hair was gold with all colors. His hair was gold with all colors in it, and his face was as bright as the sun. His eyes were like stars, literally other lights. The child was born with a fully developed intellect. As soon as he was born, it was recognized that he was fully intelligent. When people said something humorous, he would laugh. They recognized that he had a great intellect, except that he did not yet have the coordination of an adult enough to speak, etc. The king had a bard, melitz in Hebrew, an orator who was a master of rhetoric, and poetry. He could speak and compose wonderful poems, as well as songs and praise to the king. Although the bard was very skillful in his art in his own right, the king showed him a path through which he could ascend and receive poetic skills. As a result, he became an extremely skilled bard. The king also had a wise man. The wise man was very intelligent in his own right, but the king showed him a path through which he could ascend and receive wisdom. Through this, he became an extraordinarily wise man. The mighty warrior was also a warrior in his own right, but the king showed him a path through which he could ascend and receive great strength. Through this, he became an extraordinarily fearsome warrior. There is a sword that is suspended in mid-air. This sword has 3 powers. When the sword is lifted, all the enemy's officers flee in panic, and the enemy is automatically defeated. Without any leadership, they cannot do battle. Still, it is possible for the survivors to get together and do battle. But the sword has 2 edges, and these have 2 additional powers. One edge makes the entire enemy army fall. The other edge causes them to become emaciated, the sickness known as dar, with their flesh falling away. One need only stand still and swing the sword toward the enemy. I think maybe it says in Hebrew, lift up the sword, with the movement that you do with the sword. Just the movement that you do with the sword. One need only stand still and swing the sword toward the enemy, and each edge has this effect. The king showed the mighty warrior the path to that sword. It is from there that he received his great strength in battle. The same was true of me. The king showed me the path to my occupation. From there I received what I needed. The king also had a faithful friend. The bond of friendship between him and the king was wonderful and awesome, so that it was impossible for them to go without seeing each other for any length of time. Nevertheless, there were times when they had to be separated where they had to be separated to some extent. Therefore, they had portraits made of themselves together. Whenever they were separated from each other, they would have great pleasure from these pictures. The pictures showed the great friendship between the king and his friend, how they hugged and kissed each other with great affection. These images had the power that anyone looking at them would have feelings of extremely deep love. That is, the attribute of love would come to whoever gazed at these images. The faithful friend also received love from the place that the king showed him. There came a time when each of the king's men went to the place where he would receive his power. The bard, the mighty warrior, and all the other king's men went to their places to renew their powers. At that time, there was a powerful hurricane which threw the whole world into confusion. It transformed sea into dry land, and dry land into sea, deserts into inhabited land, and inhabited land into deserts. The entire world was thus turned upside down. When this hurricane struck the king's palace, it did not do any damage. However, when the storm struck, it carried away the child of the queen's daughter. In the middle of the panic caused when the beautiful child was carried away, the queen's daughter ran after it. The king and queen also pursued. They became scattered, and no one knows where they are. The rest of us were not there at the time, since each of us had gone up to his place to renew his power. When we returned, we could not find them. The hand was also lost. The hand was also lost at that time. Since that time, we became scattered, and none of us can go to his place to renew his power. The whole world was turned upside down and thrown into confusion, where all the places were exchanged, the sea becoming dry land and the like. It is certainly impossible now to go up on the original paths. Now that places have been altered and exchanged, we need different paths. Therefore, we are no longer able to return to the places where we renew our powers. Nevertheless, the trace, the reshima, that remains with each of us is still very great. Now, if this warrior is the king's mighty warrior, he is certainly a very great warrior. The text of Nassan adds, it appears to me that something is missing. See below. All this was the master of prayer's reply to the men. When they heard what he was saying, they were very astounded. They kept the master of prayer with them and did not allow him to leave. They realized that the mighty warrior advancing on them might just be the warrior whom the master of prayer knew. Meanwhile, the mighty warrior was coming closer and closer, constantly sending messengers. Finally, he arrived and camped right outside the city. When he sent his emissaries, the people were terrified. They asked the master of prayer for some advice. He told them to investigate the ways and customs of this warrior, so as to determine whether or not he was the mighty warrior of the king. The master of prayer left and went out to the mighty warrior. When he came to the mighty warrior's camp, he began to speak to one of the warrior's guards to determine if he was the king's warrior. The master of prayer asked him, "What is your occupation? How did you join up with this warrior?" The soldier replied to the master of prayer, telling him this story. It all happened in this manner. In our chronicles, Chronikish in Yiddish, it is written that there was a great hurricane in the world. This hurricane turned the whole world upside down. The sea was transformed into dry land and dry land into sea. Desolate areas became inhabited, while inhabited areas became desolate. It threw the whole world into confusion. After this period of panic and confusion, where all the world was disoriented, the people of the world decided to elect a king. They then delved into the question as to who would be most fit to be elected king. Upon deliberation, they finally said the most important consideration is the goal of life. Therefore, the person who strives the most toward this goal is the most fit to be king. But then they had to determine the goal of life. Regarding this question, there were many factions. One faction said that the main goal is honor, kavod. In the world, the main consideration is honor. If a person is not given proper honor, or if people say something that impinges on his honor, he can even commit murder. Or it says if he's murdered, he could even commit murder, or it says if he is murdered. He is mortally offended, because honor is most important among people. Even after death, the main consideration is honor. People are careful to honor the dead, bearing him with honor. They even say to him, whatever is being done for your sake, for your honor. The dead have nothing more to do with wealth or pleasure, but still, people are very careful to honor the dead. Therefore, honor is the main goal of life. They also had other confused, foolish, logical reasons. The same was true of all the other groups, which shall be discussed presently. They also had logical arguments for their confused, foolish opinions. Some of them are discussed, but the Rebbe of blessed memory did not want to present all of the confused logic for these opinions. Some of the logic is so twisted that it would be possible for people to take it seriously and fall into error. They were thus led to agree that the main goal is honor. They therefore felt that they would have to seek an honored man who also pursued honor, loidev kavod. Such an honored man would be one who pursued honor and also gained honor. If he was an honored man who already had honor, then when he pursued honor and desired it, his nature would help him attain it. Since the goal is honor, such a man would be striving for the goal and also attaining it. In their foolish and confused opinion, such a man would be most fitting as king. They went out to find such a man. They finally discovered an old gypsy beggar who was being carried and followed by some 500 gypsies. The beggar was blind, crippled, and mute, and the people following him were all members of his clan. They were his brothers and sisters, as well as the children that he had sired. These were the people who followed him and carried him. This beggar was very particular about his honor. He had a nasty temper and was always angry at them and scolding them. He constantly ordered different people to carry him, and then became angry with them. Obviously, this old beggar was a highly honored person. He also pursued honor, since he was so particular about it. This faction therefore felt that it would be best to accept him as their king. The land itself also had influence. Some lands had an influence that was particularly conducive to honor, while other lands were conducive to other traits. Therefore, the group which had determined that the main goal was honor sought a land conducive to honor. They found a land which was particularly good in this respect and settled there. Another faction decided that honor was not the main goal. Instead, they concluded that the main goal was murder. It is obvious that all things come to an end and decay. Everything in the world, whether herbs, plants, or people, deteriorates and decays. Therefore, the final goal of everything is decay and destruction. Hence, a murderer who kills people, destroys lives, is doing very much to bring the world to its goal. This group therefore concluded that the goal of life is murder. The man who would be most qualified to be king would be a murderer who was easily provoked and was fiercely jealous. According to their warped opinion, such a person would be qualified to be king. While seeking such a person, they heard an outcry. "What is this loud outcry?" they asked. They were told the reason for this outcry is that a man just slit the throats of his father and mother. Could there be a murderer with a harder heart or a fiercer temper than this? They exclaimed. "Here is a man who killed his own father and mother." According to their opinion, this man had attained the goal of life, and it was good in their eyes. They accepted him to be their king. They then chose a land that was conducive to murder. It was a hilly, mountainous land where murderers lived. They settled there with their king. Another faction maintained that the person best qualified to be king was one who had a great abundance of food, but who did not eat the food of ordinary people, but highly refined food such as milk, which does not make the mind too physical. Such a person would be qualified to be king. They could not, however, immediately find a person who was nourished in such a manner. They therefore chose as a temporary king a wealthy man who had a great abundance of food. He would rule until they could find the kind of person whom they desired, who did not eat like other men. Meanwhile, until they found a person with the full qualifications, this wealthy man would be king, after which he would reign. They accepted this man as king and chose a land that was conducive toward their goal, settling there. Another faction maintained that a beautiful woman was most qualified to rule. They held that the main goal was that the land be populated, since it was for this reason that the world was created. Since a beautiful woman arouses the desire to populate the world, she brings about the goal, and such a beautiful woman is best qualified to rule. They chose a beautiful woman, and she became their queen. They then sought out a land conducive to this and settled there. Another group maintained that the main goal was speech. The primary advantage that man has over other animals is that he is able to speak. They accordingly sought out an orator who was an expert in language, who knew many languages and spoke them all the time. Such a person would be closest to the goal. They went and found a crazy Frenchman who was constantly talking to himself. They asked him if he knew languages, and he did. According to their foolish, confused opinion, he had reached the goal. He was a master of language and knew many languages. Moreover, he spoke very much, since he was constantly talking to himself. He was very good in their opinion, and they accepted him as king. They also chose for themselves a land that was conducive to their concept, and they settled there with their king. One could be sure that he led them in a straight path. Another faction maintained that the main goal was joy. When a child is born, people are joyous. When there is a wedding, they are joyous. When they conquer a land, they are joyous. Therefore, the goal of everything is joy. They therefore sought a man who was always happy. He would be closest to the goal, and was best qualified to be king. They went and found a heathen, wearing a filthy shirt. Heathen, orel in Hebrew, denoting one who is uncircumcised. In Yiddish, goy, a Gentile. They went and found a heathen, wearing a filthy shirt and carrying a bottle of whiskey. A number of heathens were following him. Since he was very drunk, this heathen was very happy. When they saw that this heathen was very happy and had no worries, he was very good in their opinion, since he had attained the goal of joy. They accepted him as their king. One can be sure that he led them in the straight path. They also chose a land which was conducive to their concept. It was a place of vineyards and the like, which they could use to make wine. Out of the seeds they made brandy, so that nothing would go to waste. Their main goal was to become drunk and thus always be happy. Actually, of course, this had nothing to do with their concept of joy. Since they had nothing for which to be happy still, they felt that they were attaining their goal by being happy even though they had no reason. They therefore chose a land conducive to this, and they went and settled there. Another faction maintained that the most important thing was wisdom. They sought for themselves a very wise man and made him their king. They also sought a land which was conducive to wisdom, and they settled there. Another faction maintained that the main goal was to pamper oneself with food and drink, pamper pilivin in Yiddish, and thus develop large muscles. They therefore sought a man who had large muscles and who exercised to enlarge them. Such a person would have large limbs, thus having a greater portion in the world, taking up more space in the world. The person with the largest limbs would therefore be closest to the goal and should be king. They went and found a very tall athlete, a Weinger in Yiddish, and he was good in their opinion. He was a person with large limbs and close to the goal, so they accepted him as king. They also sought a land that was conducive to this, and they went and settled there. There was another faction who maintained that none of this could be the goal of life. The main goal was to pray to God and to be humble and lowly. They sought for themselves a prayer leader, Baal Tefillah, and made him their king. If one examines this, one will understand that each of these factions was greatly in error, except for this last group. Their goal was a true one. Happy are they. All this was what one of the soldiers told the master of prayer. The soldier explained that the soldiers who had joined the mighty warrior belonged to the faction of bodybuilders, who took as their king a man with a large body. One day, literally a dame came, and it was the day. A group of these men were following the main group with the supply wagons, ibas in Yiddish, carrying food, drink, and the like. In general, people were very much afraid of these bodybuilders, since they were large, powerful men. Whoever encountered them would turn aside from the road to avoid them. As this camp was traveling, they encountered a warrior. When he encountered the camp, he did not turn aside from the road. Instead, he went right into the middle of the camp and scattered the men in all directions. The men of the camp were very much afraid of him. He then went into the wagons that were following the camp and ate all their provisions. This was all a great wonder in their eyes. He was so strong that he was not afraid of the entire camp. He went right into the middle of them and ate all their provisions. The men immediately fell before him and exclaimed, "Long live the king!" They knew that this mighty warrior was certainly qualified as king, since in their opinion the main goal was to be a bodybuilder. Therefore, the king would relinquish the kingdom, since they had found a mighty warrior who was such a bodybuilder to rule them. The mighty warrior The mighty warrior whom they encountered was thus accepted as the king of the group, who had concluded that the main thing was to be a bodybuilder. The soldier concluded, "He is the mighty warrior with whom we are now conquering the world." But he said that he had an ulterior motive for wanting to conquer the world. His intent is not that the world be subject to him. Rather, he has a completely different motive. This mighty warrior who is your king, asked the master. This mighty warrior who is your king, asked the master of prayer, what sort of power does he have? He replied to him, there was one land that did not want to surrender to him. The mighty warrior took his sword, and it has 3 powers. When he lifted it, all the enemy officers fled. He then described the 3 powers of the mighty warrior's sword as discussed earlier. When the master of prayer heard this, he realized that this was certainly the mighty warrior who had been with his king. The master of prayer asked if it would be possible for him to meet with the mighty warrior who was their king. They replied that they would have to speak to the mighty warrior and asked if he would grant an audience. When they asked, he granted the audience. When the master of prayer came to the mighty warrior, they immediately recognized each other. They were both very happy at being reunited. Their joy, however, was intermingled with tears. When they remembered the king and his men, they wept. Therefore the 2 of them rejoiced and wept. The master of prayer and the mighty warrior then discussed how they had come to be where they were. The mighty warrior told the master of prayer that at the time of the great hurricane, they had all been scattered. When he came back from the place he had gone to renew his power, he did not find the king or any of his men. However, as he traveled, he passed by the king and all his men. Although he could not actually find them there, he understood that these were the places of each of the men. Thus, when he passed by one place, he understood that the king was certainly there, but he could not search for him. Literally, he could not seek him and find him, so as to find him. When he passed by another place, he understood that the queen had been there, but he could not find her. Similarly, he passed by the places of all the king's men. However, he concluded to the master of prayer, I did not pass near your place. The master of prayer replied to the mighty warrior, I also passed by the places of all of them, as well as your place. I passed by one place and saw the king's crown there. I understood that the king was certainly there. However, I had no way of seeking him or finding him. I went further and passed a sea of blood. I understood that this was certainly made from the tears of the queen. Who had wept because of all that had happened. The queen was certainly there, but it was not possible to seek and find her. Similarly, I passed a sea of milk. I understood that this was certainly made from the milk of the queen's daughter, whose son was lost. She was strained by her abundance of milk, and this produced the sea of milk. The queen's daughter was certainly there, but it was not possible to seek and find her. I went further and saw some of the infant's golden hairs lying on the ground. I did not take any of them. I knew for certain that the infant was there, but it was not possible to seek and find him. I traveled further and passed a sea of wine. I knew for certain that this was made from the words of the bard, who consoled the king and queen, and then consoled the queen's daughter. These words produced the sea of wine, as it is written, the roof of your mouth is like the finest wine. However, I could not find him. I traveled further and saw standing a stone upon which was engraved an image of the king's hand. With all its lines, I realized that the king's wise man was there, and that he had engraved an image of the hand on a stone for himself. However, it was impossible to find him. I also traveled further and saw, arranged on a mountain, golden tables and credences, show cupboards, credenzen in Yiddish, and other treasures of the king, I understood that the king's treasurer was certainly there, but it was not possible to find him. The mighty warrior replied, I also passed by all these places. I took some of the child's golden hairs. I took 7 hairs, each of a different color, and they are very precious to me. I remained in my place and nourished myself with grass and the like as much as possible. Finally, when I did not have anything else to eat, I went on my way. However, when I left my place, I forgot my bow. I saw the bow, replied the master of prayer, and I knew for certain that it was your bow, but I could not find you. The mighty warrior told the master of prayer what happened after he left there. I was traveling continuously until I came to the camp of the bodybuilders. When I entered the camp, I was ravenously hungry, and I had to eat something, but as soon as I came in, they made me their king. I am now conquering the world. In doing so, I hope that I will be able to find the king and his men. The master of prayer spoke to the mighty warrior about what could be done with the people of the land which had fallen into the desire for money to such an extent that they made the wealthiest citizens into gods. He told him about all their foolish beliefs. The mighty warrior told the master of prayer that he had heard from the king that when a person becomes entrapped by any desire, it is possible to pull him out. However, if somebody becomes trapped by the lust for wealth, it is totally impossible to get him out of it. Therefore, nothing can be done for these people. It is totally impossible to get them away from their error. However, he had also heard from the king that the one remedy is the path to the sword from which he received his power. Through this path, he could get a person out of the desire for wealth, even though he has fallen into it and is immersed in it. The mighty warrior then sat together with the master of prayer for a while. Regarding the respite that the citizens had asked the master of prayer to gain for them, he got the mighty warrior to grant it, and to spare the citizens for a period of time. The master of prayer and the mighty warrior then established a code with which they could communicate with each other, and the master of prayer went on his way. Along the way, the master of prayer saw people walking and praying. They were carrying prayer books. He was afraid of them, and they were afraid of him. He stood up and prayed. They also prayed. Then he asked them, "Who are you?" They replied, "At the time of the great hurricane, all the people of the world were divided into different factions, each with its own ideology. These were the various groups mentioned earlier. We chose for ourselves to pray constantly to God. We found ourselves a prayer leader and made him king." When the master of prayer heard this, it was very good in his eyes, since this was also what he desired. He began to speak to them and reveal to them the way he prayed, as well his works and ideas. When they heard his words, their eyes were open, and they realized the greatness of the master of prayer. The king abdicated, and they immediately made the master of prayer their king, since they realized that he was a very great person. The master of prayer taught them and enlightened them, making them into very great saints. They were righteous people before, since they engaged only in prayer, but the master of prayer enlightened them so that they became awesome saints. The master of prayer sent a note to the mighty warrior informing him how he had discovered this group and had become their king. Meanwhile, the people of the land of wealth became even more devout in their practices and modes of worship. The deadline that the mighty warrior had set was coming closer and closer, and they were extremely frightened. They performed their services, offered sacrifice, incense, and prayers, worshipping their gods. They agreed among themselves that they had no other choice but to carry out their original plan and send to the land of extraordinary wealth, where they considered all the people gods. Since all these people were gods, they would certainly be able to help them. They sent emissaries to that land. On the way, the emissaries got lost. As they traveled, they encountered a stranger, walking with the staff. The staff was worth more than all of their gods' wealth. It contained precious stones that were worth more than the wealth of all their gods. both in their homeland and the gods to whom they were going. This staff was worth more than the wealth of all of them. The stranger was also wearing a hat, kapelish, set with precious stones that was also worth an enormous amount. The emissaries immediately fell before him, bowing and prostrating themselves. The stranger had such extraordinary wealth that in their opinion he could be the god over all their gods. Actually, the stranger that they met was the treasurer of the master of prayer's king. "Do you find this surprising?" remarked the stranger. "Come with me. I will show you real wealth." He took them to the mountain where he had set out the king's treasures, and he showed them to the emissaries. They immediately fell down, bowing and prostrating themselves. According to their beliefs, this was the God over all gods. This was their false belief in money and wealth discussed earlier. Nevertheless, they did not offer sacrifice to him there, although they considered him the God of gods and would have sacrificed themselves to him. These emissaries had been warned before leaving that they should not offer sacrifice. There was concern that if they offered sacrifice on their journey, none of them would survive. Perhaps they will find some treasure on the way. One of them might go to the bathroom and find a treasure there, and he would be considered a god. If they began to sacrifice themselves to it, not one of them would survive. Therefore, the people of the land warned the emissaries that they should not offer any sacrifice at all along the way. This is why the emissaries did not offer sacrifice to the treasurer. Nevertheless, because of his tremendous wealth, it seemed obvious to them that he was the God of all gods. The emissaries therefore decided that it would be unnecessary for them to go to the gods, that is, to the land of extraordinary wealth, where they considered everyone to be gods. This stranger could certainly help them, since he was the greatest god of them all, according to their twisted belief. After all, he had more wealth than all of them. They therefore asked him to accompany them back to their land. He agreed and went with them. When they arrived home, the citizens were very happy to have found such a god. They were certain that he would bring them great salvation, since, with such tremendous wealth, he was obviously a most powerful god. The king's treasurer, whom the people took for a god, issued orders that prior to the carrying out of certain reforms in the land, they should not offer sacrifices at all. Actually, the treasurer was an extremely righteous person, since he was one of the king's men, who were all great saints. He detested all the evil and foolish customs of this land, but was not able to make them change their evil ways. But the least he could do at the time was to stop them from bringing sacrifices. The citizens began to ask him about the mighty warrior who was threatening them. The treasurer also answered, "It is possible that this is the mighty warrior whom I know." It is possible that this is the mighty warrior whom I know. The treasurer went out to the mighty warrior. He asked the warrior's men if it would be possible to meet with them. They said that they would inform him, and when they asked him, he gave permission. When the treasurer came to the mighty warrior, they recognized each other, and there was great joy and weeping. The mighty warrior told the treasurer, "I have also seen our saintly master of prayer, and he has become a king." The treasurer told the mighty warrior that he had passed by the places of the king and all his people, but he had not passed by the places of the master of prayer or the mighty warrior. He had not passed near either of these two places. The treasurer and the mighty warrior discussed the land of wealth and spoke about how they had become so confused until they believed in utter nonsense. The mighty warrior gave the treasurer the same reply that he had given the master of prayer, telling him that the king had said that if a person is immersed in such a lust for wealth, it is impossible to bring him out except through the path to the sword, where he got his power for battle. This was the only way to get people out of it. The mighty warrior extended the deadline. The treasurer spoke to the mighty warrior, asking him to extend the deadline. And the mighty warrior did so. The treasurer and the mighty warrior then set up a code between them. The treasurer then left the mighty warrior and returned to the land of wealth. The treasurer admonished them for their evil ways, telling them that they were in error and totally confused in their lust for wealth. But it did not help at all. They were already too deeply immersed in it. However, since both the master of prayer and the treasurer had admonished them so much, they became perplexed. Even though they maintained their beliefs very strongly and did not want to turn away from their error, they would say, "This is true. Please get us out of our mistaken beliefs. If this is true, please get us out of our mistaken beliefs." Whenever they were admonished, they would reply, "If it is as you say, and we are in such great error, do something to change our beliefs." The treasurer was able to give them advice, telling them that he knew the source of the mighty warrior's power and the place from which he received his power to wage war. He told them about the sword from which the mighty warrior had the power to be victorious, concluding, "Therefore let us all go, all of you and myself, to the place of the sword. We will then be able to gain power against him." The treasurer's intent was that if he could bring them there, he would be able to release them from their erroneous beliefs. He knew that the path to the sword was the only remedy for the lust for wealth. The citizens accepted his advice and agreed to go with him to the sword. The treasurer thus set off along with the greatest people of the land, who were considered gods. These gods were bedecked with gold and silver jewelry as they traveled together. The treasurer informed the mighty warrior that he was taking the people to the place of the sword, and that his intent was that along the way they might be successful in finding the king and his men. "I will go with you," declared the mighty warrior. The mighty warrior disguised himself so that the people accompanying the treasurer would not recognize that he was the warrior. He disguised himself and accompanied the treasurer. Then they decided that they would inform the master of prayer. When they informed him, he said that he would also go with them. The master of prayer went to them, instructing his men to pray to God to make their mission successful so that they would be worthy of finding the king and his men. This had always been the supplication of the master of prayer, and he had instructed his men to pray for this and had composed appropriate prayers. But now that he was setting out with the treasurer and the mighty warrior, he told them that they must pray even more at all times that he should be worthy of finding the king. When the master of prayer came to the treasurer and the warrior, there was great joy and weeping. The three of them, the treasurer, the mighty warrior, and the master of prayer, set off along with the wealthiest people of the land, who were considered gods. They continued traveling until they came to a land surrounded by guards. They asked the guards about the affairs of the land, as well as the identity of their king. The guards replied that when there was the great hurricane that divided the human race into different factions, the people of their land concluded that the main thing in life was wisdom. They had originally accepted upon themselves a great sage as king. However, recently they had discovered a great wise man who had extraordinary intelligence. Their king had abdicated his throne, and they had accepted this wise man as their king. For them, the main thing in life was wisdom, and therefore, since they had discovered such an extraordinary wise man, they accepted him as their king. The three of them, the treasurer, the mighty warrior, and the master of prayer, observed, "It seems that this is our wise man." It seemed that this was the wise man of their king. They asked if it would be possible to meet with him. The guards replied that they would inform him and seek his permission. They went, and when they asked, he granted an audience. The three went to the wise man, who was the king of that land, and they immediately recognized each other. This king was the wise man of their king. There was obviously great joy and weeping. They wept, since they did not know how they would be able to find the king and his other men. They asked the wise man if he knew where the king's hand was. He answered that he had the hand with him. However, since the time that they had been scattered by the great hurricane and the king had been concealed from them, he no longer looked at the hand, since it was only meant to be used by the king. But he had engraved an image of the hand on a stone, so that to some degree he would be able to use it for his own purposes. He would not gaze at the hand itself at all. They spoke to the wise man and asked him how he had come to this land. He told them that at the time of the great hurricane he traveled on his way. As he traveled, he passed by the entire group, except for the places of those three, the master of prayer, the mighty warrior, and the treasurer, whom he did not pass. Finally, the people of this land found him and took him as their king. Now he must lead them according to their way, which is the way of wisdom, until after a long time he would be able to bring them back to the truth. They spoke to the wise man about the people of the land which had erred and had become confused by the worship of wealth. They said, "If all of us had been isolated and scattered only to make that land good again, it would be enough for us, since they have become so foolish and imbued with their error." Actually, all the factions were in error and confused, and needed to be brought back to the true goal. This was true even of the group that had chosen wisdom as a goal. Even this group had not attained the true goal and still needed rectification and repentance, since they had chosen for themselves secular wisdom and heresy, apicorsis. Nevertheless, all the other groups were relatively easy to bring back from their errors. The group of money worshippers, however, were so immersed in it that it would be virtually impossible to get them out of it. The wise man also told them that he had heard from the king that it was possible to get a person out of any desire except for the desire for wealth. If one has fallen into that desire, one can only be brought out through the path to the sword. The wise man also wanted to go with them, so all four set out together. The foolish gods also went with them. They traveled on until they came to another land. There they also asked about the land and the identity of its king. The people replied, "Ever since the great hurricane, the people of this land concluded that the main thing in life is speech, and therefore they sought a master of language as king. Finally, they found a master of language and poetry who was an extraordinary speaker, and appointed him as king. Since this man was such a great speaker, the previous king abdicated his throne for him. The four observed, 'This is our bard.' They realized that this was their king's bard, and they asked if it would be possible for them to meet with this king. The people said that they would inform him and seek permission. When they asked, he granted an audience. The four went to the king of this land, and they saw that he was their king's bard. They recognized one another, and there was great joy and weeping among them. The bard joined them, and they traveled on, hoping to find the rest of the king's men. They saw that God had granted them success, and that they had already been successful in finding some of their companions. They realized that this was due to the merit of their saintly master of prayer, who was always praying for this. Through his prayers they had been worthy of finding their companions. They thus traveled on, hoping that they would also be worthy of finding the others. Eventually they came to a land, and they inquired about the land and the identity of its king. They were answered that this was the group that had chosen for themselves joy and drink as their goal. Their king therefore had been a drunkard who was always happy. They had then found a man sitting in a sea of wine. This was very good in their opinion, since this man must be an extraordinary drunkard, so they accepted him as their king. They asked to meet with him, and were granted an audience. The five companions went to this king, and discovered that he was their king's faithful friend. He was sitting in the sea of wine made from the words of consolation spoken by the bard. The people of that land had seen him in the sea of wine, and had thought him to be an unusual drunkard. Therefore they appointed him king. They recognized one another, and there was great joy and weeping. The faithful friend joined the others, and they continued their journey and came to another land. They asked the guards, "Who is your king?" The guards replied that their ruler was a beautiful woman. She brought people closer to the goal, since the goal was to populate the world. At first they had chosen a beautiful woman as queen, but they had later found a very extraordinarily beautiful woman to be queen. The companions understood that this must be the queen's daughter. So they asked to meet with her, and were granted an audience. When they came to the queen, they recognized that she was the queen's daughter. Their great joy was beyond estimation. "How did you get here?" they asked her. She answered that when the hurricane came that snatched away the precious infant from its crib, she had gone out after the infant in a panic, but she could not find him. Her breasts were engorged with milk, and this created the sea of milk. Then the people of this land found her, and accepted her as their ruler. There was great joy at the reunion, but they also wept very much because the precious infant was lost, and because she did not know the whereabouts of her father and mother. The mighty warrior, who was the queen's husband, had now arrived, and the land now had a king. The queen's daughter, who was queen of this land, asked the master of prayer to cleanse this land of its lasciviousness, Since their main goal involved beautiful women, they were very much immersed in sexual desire. She therefore asked the master of prayer to cleanse them, at least temporarily, so that they not become engrossed in lust. It was a matter of faith to them that this was the goal of existence. Each of the factions had chosen a bad trait as their goal. and each one treated their trade as a matter of faith. Therefore, they were very much immersed in it. The queen therefore asked the master of prayer to cleanse them of their trait to some degree at this time. After this, they all set out to seek the king and the other ones. They traveled and finally came to a land asking, "Who is your king?" The people answered that their king was a yearling. Their king was a yearling. This was the faction that had chosen for themselves as king a person who had an abundance of food and who did not eat the food of other people. They had temporarily accepted a wealthy man as king, but later they had discovered a person sitting in a sea of milk, and this was very good in their eyes. All his life this person had been nourished by the milk, and therefore he was not sustained by the food of the rest of the world. The people therefore accepted him as king. They called him the yearling, since he was nourished by milk like a 1-year-old child. They understood that this was the lost child, and they asked to meet with him. He was asked, and they were granted an audience. When they went in, they recognized one another. The infant who had become king recognized them, even though he had been a tiny infant when he was separated from them. Still, he had possessed a high intelligence from the time of his birth, having been born with a fully developed intellect. He therefore was able to recognize them. They certainly recognized him, and there was awesome joy, but they still wept, since they did not know anything about the king and queen. "How did you get here?" they asked him. He replied that the great hurricane had snatched him up and carried him someplace. He sustained himself with whatever he could find in any way possible. Finally, he came to a sea of milk, and he understood that this milk was certainly from his mother. She had become engorged with this milk, and it had produced this sea. He had sat in that sea of milk and had sustained himself with it until the people of this land had come and taken him as their king. They continued traveling until they came to another land. When they asked, "Who is your king?" the people answered that they had chosen murder as their goal and had set a murderer as their king. Then they had found a woman sitting in a sea of blood and had accepted her as their ruler. Since she was sitting in a sea of blood, she must have been a very fierce murderess. They also asked to meet her and were granted an audience. When they went to her, they saw that she was the queen. She was constantly weeping, and out of her tears the sea of blood was formed. When they recognized one another, there was very great joy, but they still wept, since they still did not know anything about the king. They went further and came to another land. They asked, "Who is your king?" And the people replied that they had chosen for themselves an honored man as king, since for them the main goal was honor. Then they had found in a field an old man sitting with a crown on his head. Such a man appeared very honored, and he was good in their eyes, since he wore his crown even in a field. So they accepted him as king. The companions realized that this was certainly their king. They asked if it would be possible to meet him, and they were granted an audience. When they went in, they recognized that it was the king. The joy that they experienced is impossible to imagine. The wealthy leaders of the land of wealth, who were gods in their land, who were accompanying them, did not have any idea of what was happening and the reason for this joy. Now the entire holy gathering had come together. They sent the master of prayer to all lands which had chosen evil traits as their goals in life, so that he would rectify and purify them and get them to repent their foolishness. Each land had its own foolishness and error, but the master of prayer had the power to go to them and bring them to repent. He had power and permission from all the kings of these lands. Since their kings were all members of the holy gathering of the king had now been restored and had assembled his men who were kings over all the factions. The master of prayer left with their authority to cleanse their lands and bring them to repent. The mighty warrior spoke to the king about the people in the land which had fallen into the worship of wealth. The warrior said to the king, "I heard from you that the only way to release those who are immersed in the worship of the lust for wealth is through the path that I have to the sword." "That is true," replied the king. The king then told the mighty warrior that on the road to the sword there is a path to the side. That path leads to a mountain of fire, upon which crouches a lion. When the lion wants to eat, he attacks the flocks, taking the sheep and cattle and eating them. The herdsmen, literally shepherds, know this and watch their sheep very carefully because of it. The lion, however, does not pay any attention whatsoever to this. Whenever he wants to eat, he attacks the flocks, And even though the herdsmen strike him and shout at him, the lion does not pay any attention. He takes whatever sheep and cattle he wants, roars, and eats them. The mountain of fire is totally invisible. There is another path off to the side leading to a kitchen, kech, besa bishul. There are all kinds of foods in that kitchen, but no fire. The food is cooked by the mountain of fire, and although the mountain of fire is very far away, there are channels and pipes from the mountain of fire to the kitchen, and these cook the food. The kitchen is also invisible. However, there is a sign of where the kitchen is. Birds hover over it, and one can thus know the location of the kitchen. By flapping their wings, the birds make the fire burn more fiercely, or bank it so that it will not burn more fiercely than necessary. They thus make the fire burn as required by the food. One type of food may need one heat, while another needs a different heat. Depending on the food, they make the fire burn accordingly. All this was what the king told the mighty warrior, speaking of the gods of the land of wealth, who had accompanied the others. The king said, "You must bring them in this manner. First, bring them downwind from the kitchen, so that the fragrance of the food will reach them. Then, when you give them the food, they will denounce the lust for wealth." The mighty warrior did as he had been bidden. He took the leaders of the land of wealth, who were gods in their land. These gods were there because they had accompanied the treasurer. When they had left their land with the treasurer, the citizens had given them authority to do anything necessary, and the people of the land would abide by anything these emissaries did. These emissaries were the most important people in their land as well as their gods, and no one would refute whatever they did. The mighty warrior took these men who were considered gods in their land because of their wealth and brought them along his path. When they came near the food kitchen, he brought them downwind so that the fragrance of the food reached their nostrils. They began to beg that he give them some of these delicious foods. Then he brought them away from the wind. They began to cry out that there is a horrible stench. He once again brought them in the path of the wind, and when they smelled the delicious fragrance of the food, they again asked that he give them some. He again took them away from the wind, and they cried out that there was a very awful stench. "Don't you see that there is nothing here with a vile odor?" exclaimed the mighty warrior. "The vile odor is coming from you yourselves. There is nothing else here that has a foul odor." He then gave them some of the food. As soon as they ate it, they began to throw away all their gold and silver. Each one dug himself a hole. Each person then buried himself in the hole out of great shame. As a result of tasting the food, the money smelled as vile as excrement. They tore at their faces and buried themselves, and could not lift their faces at all. Each one was ashamed of the other. In that place, wealth is the greatest shame. If someone wants to insult another, he says that the other has money. Money is so great a shame that the more money a person has, the greater his shame. Because of their great shame, they buried themselves. They could not bear to face even their friends, and much more so the mighty warrior. Each one who had a golden, Yiddish a dinar in Hebrew, a gilden or a grish, godel in Hebrew, immediately got rid of it and threw it away as fast as he could. The mighty warrior then came and took them out of their holes and graves. He said to them, "Come with me. Now you no longer have to be afraid of the mighty warrior. I myself am the mighty warrior." They asked the mighty warrior to give them some of the food to bring back to their land. They themselves now totally rejected wealth, but they also wanted all the people of their land to abandon the lust for wealth. He gave them the food, and they brought it back to their land. As soon as the people were given this food, they began to throw away their gold and silver. Out of great shame, they hid themselves in dirt caves, mechilos. The wealthiest ones, who were their gods, were all the more ashamed. The inferior ones, who were considered beasts, were also ashamed for feeling inferior because of their lack of wealth. Now it was revealed that wealth is the main thing of which to be ashamed. This was because the foods had the special power that anyone who ate them would become extremely repulsed by money, and to him it would have a stench like excrement and filth. They then cast away their gods of silver and their gods of gold. The mighty warrior then sent for the master of prayer, who gave them a means of repentance and rectification, and thus purified them. The king ruled over the entire world. The whole world returned to God and occupied itself only with Torah, prayer, repentance, and good deeds. Amen. May this be his will. Blessed be God forever. Amen and amen. The scripture states that God has an oven in one place and that the fire is in another place, far from the oven. It is thus written, the word of God, whose fire is in Sion and whose oven is in Yerushalayim. One should consult this entire chapter since it relates to the concept of the story. It is written, woe is to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses. The Egyptians are humans and not gods, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. This is speaking of the land which the land of wealth thought would help them. They assumed that all the people were gods and their horses were angels, as we see in the story. This is why the verse concludes, the Egyptians are humans and not gods, and their horses are flesh. Understand this. God shall stretch out his hand, and the helpers shall stumble, and the one being helped shall fall, and they shall perish together. This relates to the hand in the story. On the hand, the master of prayer saw that both the helper and the one seeking help would be destroyed, as mentioned in the story. A lion growls over its prey, even though many shepherds are called against it. As birds fly, this relates to the lion and the birds in the story. Look at the story well, and you will understand it. On that day, each man shall cast away his gods of silver and his gods of gold. Assyria shall fall by the sword, not by man, and he shall flee from the sword, and his rock shall pass away in terror. This relates to the three powers of the sword in the story. The expression shall fall and shall flee denote these powers. His rock shall pass away in terror denotes the emaciation, where one loses one's strength and power. The expression rock here denotes strength. This is the third power of the sword. Look at this carefully and you will understand. The section then concludes, the word of God, whose fire is in Sion and whose oven is in Yerushalayim. This is the oven and fire in the story. If you look, see, and understand, you will find that this chapter explains the entire story. All these are the words of the Rebbe of blessed memory. The Rebbe of blessed memory said explicitly that the entire story from beginning to end is alluded to in this chapter. He said, everything in the story can be found in various other verses, but the main story is from the above mentioned chapter. However, no one knows how this is true except where he revealed it explicitly. There are also other concepts in the story that are alluded to in this chapter, but we were not worthy of comprehending them. However, he said explicitly that the entire story is alluded to there. The order of the king and his men in the story is the master of prayer and the mighty warrior, the treasurer and the wise man, the bard and the faithful friend, the queen's daughter and her child, and the king and queen. This is their order. It is related to the world of rectification, Olam Atikim. The following material is found at the end of the story in Hebrew. Many concepts in the story are alluded to in verses such as, you shall defile your graven images overlaid with silver, and your molten images plated with gold. You shall reject them like something unclean. And as it is written, on that day each person shall cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold to the digger of fruits, to go into the clefts of the rocks. That is, they will throw away the desire for money, which is literally idolatry. They will hide themselves in holes that were dug, as mentioned above, for money stinks, literally like excrement. It is thus written, they will make it strange like uncleanliness. They will say to it, get out, and the like. One can find all the words of this above story in verses, etc. The order of the king with his men mentioned above is this: the master of prayer and the warrior, the treasurer and the wise man, the bard and the faithful friend, the queen's daughter and the queen's daughter with her child, the king and the queen. This is their order. This is the concept of the world of rectification, Olam Atikim. There are 10 things, and they are not set in order. That is, that they are not set, the above mentioned 10, according to the order mentioned in the books of Kabbalah. However, there is a hidden meaning. The sacred texts also teach that when the influx, shefa, of one attribute passes through a second attribute, and the first influx remains there, then the second attribute sometimes takes on the name of the first one. It is because of this that the order of the characters in this story is not necessarily the same as the order of the spheres. There are also other concepts in this that are clear to those who are very expert in the sacred texts. All this our Rabbi of blessed memory said explicitly. I also understood from his words that this story alludes to the death of the kings and their rectification. Both the concept of the destruction and the concept of the rectification are related so that the destruction and rectification are depicted as they are on high. This is the reasons discussed earlier. Still, the words are hidden and sealed up. He did not reveal the mystery of this story at all. He only enlightened our eyes with verses and the above-mentioned concepts so that we would know that in this story there are great, hidden, awesome mysteries. There is none among us who understands why. Happy is he who is worthy to understand something of the mysteries of these stories mentioned in this book. All of them are wondrous new concepts. Very, very awesome. Deep, deep, who can find them? What shall we say? What shall we speak? Who heard this? And who saw these? Nanach nachmo nachmo miyuman. Nanach nachmo nachmo miyuman.